Well, we're still talking end times. Hopefully we'll be able to land the plane today. This is session 13.6 of our devotional series out of the Gospel of Mark. And when we came to chapter 13, we thought, well, let's slow down a little bit. And instead of just doing a few videos out of that one, let's do 6 or whatever it took to at least get a bird's eye view of some of these prophetic issues that are in play. And so Mark 13 is that we've talked a lot over the first 5 sessions of this Mark 13, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Hopefully you've watched those or will watch those because they build on each other so that we can get a better understanding of this Olivet Discourse, this discussion that Jesus is having with his disciples that's found in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. Hey, I'm Pastor Andrew. Thank you for continuing to join us, and I pray that this really blesses you. Well, like I said, we want to kind of land the plane if we can, and in order to do that, we're going to find ourselves a little bit all over the place. We've got to jump to Daniel. I'd like to touch on Thessalonians, and I'd like to touch on Revelation. But how do we get there? Hopefully this kind of makes sense. It can get very involved. I don't want this to be a really long video. So again, the scope of this video is meant to be simple and just introduce topics. And here's the goal. At the end of this series and at the end of this video specifically, you can hopefully say, well, at least I understand why there is a difference of opinion. I understand the cards that are on the table and the passages that are in play, along with the historical events and how to understand them. That's kind of what I want us to do. So we talked about the abomination of desolation last time that Jesus mentions in the Olivet Discourse, and how that is an allusion certainly to what happened with Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the king of the Seleucid Empire. We talked about that in the sessions, but the intriguing part is really multifaceted. Jesus says to the disciples, early 30s AD, on the Mount of Olives, when you see future, the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Man, that alone makes it curious. And then he does something else that's really important that we have to consider. He says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, seated or standing in the holy place where he ought not be, let the reader understand. The author gives us a little note that this is intense, or this is deep, or this is thought-provoking. Then those who are in Judea need to flee. So he ties this concept of the abomination of desolation with fleeing Jerusalem, right? Leaving. Now that seems like on the surface, if you remember, I think it was session 2, 13-2, this has to fit the destruction of the temple, right? The stones were thrown down like Jesus predicted at the beginning of Mark 13, the beginning of the Olivet Discourse. But then when we know historically from Josephus and others what happened with the destruction of the temple, man, it really was atrocious. Titus comes in and he tries to starve the people out, and some of the stories that come out of that are horrific. They really are horrific. It was a horrible, horrible time. But we don't have anything we could maybe conclusively say was the abomination of desolation, sort of like what we saw with Antiochus IV. That was clearly an abomination, an offense that made the temple desolate. Well, Titus, we move forward to 70 AD, Titus destroys the temple, and he surrounds the city and destroys the city and the temple. But can we say it was an abomination that leaves desolate? I mean, you certainly could. And a lot of people do. That is a position of end times views that it's done. It's already been fulfilled. There's a little bit of work to be done there to sort of show that, number one, as you recall in the verses we've talked about, that this would be the worst time that there's ever been, a tribulation so bad, it's never been since the creation of the world, nor ever will be again. Is the destruction of the temple that bad that it fits that prediction of Jesus? And it's interesting that he ties the abomination of desolation with flight or fleeing from Judea and from that area, because when the destruction of the temple happened, we have documents that show the Christians or Christ followers that took that prediction seriously were saved and escaped danger because of the fact that they listened to what Jesus said. And when they saw the city surrounded, they took off. So are those two things inseparably linked? And so we can say, yeah, the destruction of the temple fulfills the Olivet Discourse. It's a checkmate, except for just a few verses where Jesus says, then the end will come. Maybe that's talking about something else and it's less specific. That's a view. It's on the table. But here's where it gets a little bit messy. It's a little gray. We have to figure out. There is such a thing as prophetic perspective, which means if you can imagine 2 hills with a valley, there's 2 hills here with a valley in between. And if you're standing here, it looks like the top of this hill is really close, but you don't take into consideration this valley in between. And in prophecy, we see that a lot. Things seem to seem Things seem like they're going to happen so quickly, but really there's a long delay. And Daniel is kind of like that. So Jesus brings Daniel into this conversation because he says, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, then take warning or flee. So here's what we see. Certainly Antiochus is a representation of that, and Jesus alludes to that because he calls it the abomination of desolation, but then he's looking forward. And so in the context of Daniel, we see a few things. This is where it gets complicated, but we want to keep it simple. It's really Daniel 9:24-27, and we will look at the context of this vision that Daniel gets. It's kind of like the angel tells Daniel that there is a certain amount of time that are decreed for your people. So it's kind of a Jewish timetable. I really encourage you to take the time to read this slowly and carefully in multiple translations to get your arms around it. But not only for the Jewish people, but it seems sort of to the end, like to the end of all things. Maybe. Again, are we approaching this? We're just trying to be honest and read it and say, what do we know? Okay. So here's what we read. 70 weeks. This is Daniel 9:24. 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city. So that's Jewish in view. Again, Daniel was written, 600 BC or so. To finish the transgression, to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity. To bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal both vision and prophet, and to anoint the most holy place. Man, that's a powerful verse. You've got to take the time to really unpack that and think what's being said here. And then as we read forward, these are 70 weeks or weeks of years or 77s. That gets complicated, but it's a Hebrew thing. And normally if I'm teaching a longer class, I'll give examples of that where we can sort of substantially prove that, and it's really not debated much, that these are units of measurement. It's not actual 7-day weeks that are in view. So we know that. So 77s or 490 years really are determined. But then as you continue to read Daniel 9:24-27, you're going to see that it's broken up interestingly in that it's 62 weeks and 7 weeks. Okay, so it's this prophecy that seems to have a really specific timetable. And so from this decree, when you can rebuild the city and the temple. Now that's interesting, right? Because we talked about in previous sessions, the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, 586, 587 BC. Then Daniel comes on the scene because he's under the Babylonian rule. And a prophecy comes that says, there will be a decree to go back and rebuild the temple and the city. And from that time, sort of a clock is going to start. And it turns out that exactly happens. It's really profound. There's some really amazing books and works that have been done studying Daniel's timetable. And it's overwhelming how accurate it really is. Now, again, we measure history a little bit differently because back in Daniel's day, they didn't say this is the year 586 BC. So there's a margin of error for how we moderns look back and measure history to the best of our ability based on archaeology and what we have discovered. But the point that I'm trying to make here is his timetable is pretty amazing for some people who have, from a scholarly perspective, weighed out this time and measured out this time from the time of a decree, which we know happened for them to go back and rebuild the temple. This would be the beginning of the second temple. And when you get the division, read Daniel 9:24-27, you're going to find 62 weeks and 7 weeks, which is 69 weeks of years. Okay, 69 times 7. And it's almost dead on when Jesus comes onto the scene in the first century. That alone is profound. We're reading Daniel 9:24-27. And then this is where what Jesus is talking about comes into play. In verse 26, after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off and have nothing. This seems to be a reference to Christ or to the Messiah. Again, timetables come right into that. And the people of the prince who is to come. This is an interesting phrase. A lot of people are going to load into that this could be sort of an antichrist figure. Again, it's an assumption, but there's a lot more passages that will bring this together beyond the scope of this video. But the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Okay. Its end shall come with a flood, and to the end there shall be war. Desolations are decreed. And in other translations, it'll bring this Hebrew in saying like, on wings of abomination, desolations are determined. And so this is kind of where we get this abomination of desolation language that Jesus was talking about. But even in that verse, I hope you see how interesting it is. So it's predicting from the time to rebuild the temple. Again, we're just in these few verses in Daniel 9. From the time to rebuild the temple, this is Ezra and Nehemiah's story that happened in the Old Testament, to all of these ends of things with sort of when all of this stuff is going to be concluded, Daniel's saying, there's going to be so much time. And the first portion where he breaks it up in the 62 and 7 weeks, then this anointed figure we assume is Jesus, or some could assume is Jesus, would be cut off, which he was. He was crucified, but he resurrected again. And then there's this last week that's left unaccounted for. From verse 24, 70 weeks are determined until the end. And so is that week still looming out there, or was it figurative, or has it already been fulfilled? Well, this is where we have these questions to answer. What do we do with that? And with prophecy, we have to hold it with an open hand. And let me just give you quickly a couple of examples why. We could look at this and say, well, it's just figurative. You can't really try to fit all of this stuff into it and look for a specific fulfillment because you would be handling the text inappropriately. And in some cases, we would say, yeah, that's fair. We have to honor the text and not try to put our theological freight into something that it just doesn't belong. But we always have to hold it with an open hand and not be so dogmatic and strict about it, because, listen to this, if we go back in time before Jesus was born, we could read Zechariah 9:9, where a prophecy comes in that the Messiah is going to come in riding on a donkey. Or we could go to Micah 5:2, which prophesies that the Messiah would come from, or predicts that the Messiah would come from, Bethlehem. Or Isaiah 53, which prophesies that he would be pierced, and this picture of crucifixion, well before crucifixion was even a thing. If we go back in time and we read that before Jesus comes on the scene, we might have a tendency to say, you can't put all of this hope into those prophecies because they just are symbolic. That the Messiah comes from Bethlehem is maybe just speaking that he's coming from obscurity, or that he rides in on a donkey means that he is humility and lowly of heart and not, braggadocious or whatever. And, the fact that he was cut off, or the fact that he was pierced and wounded and bruised, and all of those things are just, it's figurative language to talk about his heart for the people, his love for the people. And at that time we would say, oh, I guess maybe that's kind of fair. But we fast forward and look what happened. Jesus literally fulfilled those prophecies. And so we have to hold it with an open hand, because those were in vivid detail fulfilled. And there are other prophecies that are rather ambiguous. And you're sort of like, I guess this could fill that one. But again, that's a little bit beyond the scope of this video. So Jesus refers back to Daniel's prophecy, and that hopefully helps a little bit with the context of Daniel's prophecy. I know that it gets deep, but this is where that break with the 62 plus the 7, so therefore 69 weeks of years, which is supposed to be sort of a clock to the end as you read those verses. There's this one week left hanging out there. And so a lot of people, really our options are this: either the destruction of the temple in 70 AD fulfilled all of these things and we're just done, or their future from our day and age, because of the fact that the temple's been gone since 70 AD. And this is where the discussion happens. So clearly what Jesus says in the Olivet Discourse, a lot of it, or much of it, is fulfilled in the destruction of the temple. But as you remember when I talked about the 20th century has seen more lives lost and more bloodshed than any point in history. And other philosophers and scholars have commented on this. It's pretty common knowledge in the history of the world that the 20th century has been the most loss of life. So the person who says that, and I'm not saying they're wrong, of course, a person who says that the destruction of the temple fulfills the Olivet Discourse and there really isn't anything else future, the burden of proof is a little bit on them to say, was it really the worst time ever that the world's ever seen? And it hasn't been that bad since. And there are some that do a very good job of writing to talk about that. Hopefully that's helpful. Okay. The other part of this is that in the book of Revelation, which again, very figurative, very image heavy, we totally get that. We have to take that with a grain of salt. In chapter 11, it talks about the temple. John's told to measure the temple, and you get this whole story of the temple. And then another important passage, hopefully it doesn't feel like I'm just pulling these out of nowhere, but as you read, you would come across 2 Thessalonians, and Paul writes this, this is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, now concerning the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ and our being gathered together with him, we ask you, brothers, not to be quickly shaken in mind or alarmed, either alarmed by a spirit or a spoken word or a letter seeming to be from us to the effect that the day of the Lord has come. Really, he's saying, because it hasn't. I know you've heard that, but it hasn't come. And then he says in verse 3, let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that," this is kind of important here, "he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God." Now, this is a powerful passage from the Apostle Paul. A couple things that are important here is that hasn't happened to anyone's knowledge that we know of, scholars and the like that have studied. We haven't seen anyone set themselves up to be God in the temple to fulfill what Paul understands the end times to look like. Okay? And then in Revelation chapter 11, there is this sort of ambiguous, it's not perfectly clear, is it an image of a temple? Is it a temple in heaven? Is it metaphoric? Or is it the fact that it's a vision, it's a future temple to be built? That would be the third temple. We bring this together, and then some people would say that's the abomination that makes desolate, is that, yes, there was a destruction, and Jesus in the Olivet Discourse was giving them a heads up prophecy that the destruction was going to happen, run for the hills. But the abomination of desolation really is a future event, even from our perspective, that when, this is kind of the scheme of things, and again, it's just a view, when a third temple is built, then there will be this aspect where these types of passages, and others of course, can be fulfilled, where this sort of person who seems to be this man of lawlessness and kind of identified with this Antichrist figure will seat himself in the temple, which would have to be rebuilt at this point, and seat, because it hasn't happened to date. It didn't happen up until the destruction of the temple, at least in 70 AD, if you're following me. So then there has to be, theoretically, there has to be this future event that happens, okay? And that's where people really begin to watch the news, and we're fascinated with the concept that the Temple Institute has already got everything. If you go to Israel, you should at least visit them, whether you hold this view or not. It's interesting. They're ready to build the third temple, and they're ready to begin implements of the Mosaic custom, Moses's law, so that the Jews can jump right back into where they left off before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And so there are these things at play. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. So Jesus brings in Daniel's context, but then we have these questions. Are they fulfilled? And really what we're left with is either they're very metaphoric and we can't put too much stock in it, or they were fulfilled literally in 70 AD, or some of this stuff some of it goes together with the disciples' time frame, and others are those allusions to things that are yet future. And putting those prophecies of Daniel and what Jesus said on the Olivet Discourse, Paul's understanding of the end time, certainly what he says here in 2 Thessalonians 2, and then what the images that are presented in Revelation as far as the end is concerned, paint a really big picture. And one last important note for us to consider is on this train of thought is whatever is in Revelation, like this concept of a future temple, traditionally, all historically, traditionally in the church, Revelation written by John was written in 96 AD. Well, as you well know now, the temple was destroyed in 70. So any of those types of prophecies that are dealing with a future or end time scheme would seem, doesn't have to be, but would seem to be future even now from our perspective, because the temple's been destroyed and the things described in there haven't necessarily happened the way that we would particularly understand them. Now you go, that's kind of an ambiguous phrase, but hopefully that makes sense. And so anyone who says the destruction of the temple is the fulfillment of the Olivet Discourse and most things, and really all we're waiting for is the second coming of Christ, the burden of proof now, from all of historical tradition, the burden of proof now is upon that person to say that the book of Revelation actually was written earlier than 70 AD and before the destruction of the temple. And there's a lot of good scholarly work on this, but it's just a position. And so that's important. So there's all these sort of moving parts, but I guess what I want to do is I want to say, let's lay all the cards on the table. We've considered the Olivet Discourse. We've looked into some history. Jesus pulls Daniel into the picture. Daniel seems to have this vision, Daniel 9, read it carefully, of sort of a countdown to the end of all things. We have this interesting parsing of the weeks where there's 69 weeks together and then one's off by itself. What's that about? We have some work to do there. Is it all fulfilled in the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, or like what Paul says here, or some of what Jesus says in the Olivet Discourse and what we see in Revelation? And again, this is a surface view. There's a lot more passages we could bring into play to wrestle with. Could it be future? And see, hopefully you'll know these are the cards that are on the table. This is what we have to just barely scratch the surface, but it's what we have to work with. If you enjoyed this series, I encourage you comment, maybe ask more questions, share this, subscribe, do what you can to help spread the message. And again, I'm not pushing a position. I'm not dogmatic about it, as I faithfully try to and continue to understand and study Scripture. I hold it with an open hand. Some things are so fascinating. Some things seem to be clear, and then you continue to read and you're like, oh my word, this is a little messy. I'm not sure what to do with it. But don't get sucked into that rabbit hole or that wormhole. Our mission is to spread the gospel, like we talked about in just a session or two ago. Our mission is to spread the gospel. Our mission is to help people find Jesus and follow Jesus. This is an exciting hope. Encourage each other with these words is another passage from Paul. Man, we're excited for the future and what Christ is going to do. But for now, our mission is to share the love of Christ. This is just fun stuff to study and get sharpened as we study Scripture. So God bless you. Thank you for spending some time with us. We'll continue in Mark 14 next week.